uncertainty. The wolves are gnawing at my door. I beg them to come back tomorrow. Everybody wants a piece of me. When I go to church, I pray for a better day tomorrow in these times of uncertainty. Better days are coming soon. They say they're just around the corner, but they seem a long way off to me. Now let me make amends. Every now and then my life gets crazy. I thought life was gonna get easier, but yet now it's just harder than before, yeah. Got one hand in the air, got one hand on the Bible, promising to take good care of me. Now promises are like the wind, they blow right by you come tomorrow. Promises don't feed your family. Now let me make amends. Every now and then my life gets crazy. I thought life was gonna get easier, but yet now it's just harder than before, yeah.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here today. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Paducah, graduated from Lone Oak High School, and went to Paducah Community College, which I know both of which date me in time. There's no longer a Lone Oak High School or a Paducah Community College. It is now the West Kentucky Community and Technical College. I left Paducah for the University of Kentucky for an English degree, and came back and worked in newspapers in Benton and Paducah for a few years, and then went back to the University of Kentucky for a law degree. So I've spent most of my adult life in Louisville and Lexington, where I practiced law, dabbled in writing, raised two sons with my husband Alex, who is here today, and he is a native of Mayfield. So it's important that we made this trip here. In 2003, we decided we wanted to spend more time in Western Kentucky due to our aging parents and to be close to places that we love, the lakes and Land Between the Lakes. So we saw an ad in the Courier Journal about a house, an old house that was being auctioned in Old Catawba. And so we decided that we wanted to be here and spend as much time as possible, whenever possible. So we saw we went to the auction. The house was one of the originals in Old Catawba, It was built in 1906 when Catawba was a bustling river town on the banks of the Cumberland. Well, as fate would have it, we were the lucky bidders, the top bidders on the house. And after we bought it, we dug in on the much needed renovations on this old house. And I also started researching its history. I learned that the house was built by the Ordway family, who also built the house next door for their daughter. The street had been known originally as Oak Street, long before Lake Barkley was created. That street was renamed Lake Barkley Drive after the lake rose. I found an original picture of the house at the Rose Hill Museum in Eddyville, and it had been a grand old Victorian house. It was a painted lady, so it had all the amazing colors that we had no idea, because at the time we bought it, it was just a plain white, older Victorian with a lot of woodwork, but none of the color was there. It also had extensive gardens and landscaping. So that was a surprise also. But that photograph set me to thinking about and imagining what life in Catawba had been like before the lake was created. So most of the town was taken through the power of eminent domain for the lake when it was built in the early 1960s. So this was, I think, a key part of the creation of my book, Drowned Town. It was during this time, as I was imagining what life was like in this old town, I also started working on my MFA in creative writing at Murray State in their low residency program. So we were trying to spend as much time as possible in Catawba and get to know this place. I was writing, and it was during a Christmas stay at the house. I walked the shoreline of Lake Barkley on a clear December afternoon, the time of year when the water level is at its lowest. Winter pool, they call it. It's a controlled lowering of the Cumberland River reservoir. The drawdown at the massive concrete dam just a few miles downstream reduces the likelihood of flooding from winter and spring rains. Each year when the water goes down, signs of the past reveal themselves. Beaches broaden, banks grow taller, and favorite water skiing bays become shallower and riskier to navigate as sandbars and other obstructions appear. Like the towboat captains who navigate the lake year-round, seasoned boaters know to stay within the confines of the marked, twisting channel to keep from running aground. Along the exposed shore and in the day's last light, I witnessed the outlines of house foundations, scattered bricks, even railroad spikes near where the train station once sat. The view haunted me. It still does. The drowned towns and the many lost places felt close. Their history's not so distant. This landscape underwent monumental changes when Kentucky and Barkley dams were built a half-century ago, when old river towns were demolished prior to the impoundments, and the area now known as Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area, or LBL, was deconstructed. I grew up in western Kentucky. I know the area. I've always loved the lakes in LBL. But I had no familial connection to the areas, to these sites, until that December day when I witnessed traces of what had existed in Catawba. I hadn't considered the profound personal losses and sacrifices of the people who gave up home places, communities, and livelihoods to make way for these projects. This was the beginning of what would become Drowned Town. I wanted to write about events and people that weren't widely known outside of western Kentucky, or may be heading toward being forgotten as people grow older. Between 1938 and 1944, this is, I think, a key part of the creation of my book, Drowned Town. It was during this time, as I was imagining what life was like in this old town, I also started working on my MFA in creative writing at Murray State in their low residency program. So we were trying to spend as much time as possible in Catawba and get to know this place. I was writing,
And it was during a Christmas stay at the house, I walked the shoreline of Lake Barkley on a clear December afternoon, the time of year when the water level is at its lowest. Winter pool, they call it. It's a controlled lowering of the Cumberland River Reservoir. The drawdown at the massive concrete dam just a few miles downstream reduces the likelihood of flooding from winter and spring rains. Each year when the water goes down, signs of the past reveal themselves. Beaches broaden, banks grow taller, and favorite water skiing bays become shallower and riskier to navigate as sandbars and other obstructions appear. Like the towboat captains who navigate the lake year-round, seasoned boaters know to stay within the confines of the marked, twisting channel to keep from running aground. Along the exposed shore and in the day's last light, I witnessed the outlines of house foundations, scattered bricks, even railroad spikes near where the train station once sat. The view haunted me. It still does. The drowned towns and the many lost places felt close. Their history's not so distant. This landscape underwent monumental changes when Kentucky and Barkley dams were built a half century ago, when old river towns were demolished prior to the impoundments, and the area now known as Land Between the Lakes National Recreation Area, or LBL, was deconstructed. I grew up in Western Kentucky. I know the area. I've always loved the lakes and LBL, but I had no familial connection to the areas, to these sites. Until that December day when I witnessed traces of what had existed in Catawba, I hadn't considered the profound personal losses and sacrifices of the people who gave up home places, communities, and livelihoods to make way for these projects. This was the beginning of what would become Drowntown. I wanted to write about events and people that weren't widely known outside of Western Kentucky, or may be heading toward being forgotten as people grow older. Between 1938 and 1944, I think we could click on, yeah.
Well, hang on.
It's okay.
There we go.
And this just gives you an idea. I think one of the, no, that's fine. One of the things I've realized in living in central Kentucky for most of my adult life is that the rest of the state doesn't know much about Western Kentucky. You know, it's a long way down here. I understand. So as you can see, and Kentucky's a very long state, so you have to really intend to come to the Jackson Purchase. So I think it's important. I started realizing there are so many things that people don't know about Western Kentucky and stories that have been untold. And I think that's an important part of history, is to make sure those stories get told and preserved. And what I've found, and the reason I went toward fiction, as Bill mentioned, I wanted to emphasize the emotional and personal context of these monumental changes to the geography in Western Kentucky. As you can see, there's a huge difference. These are the federal projects in the mid-20th century, Lake Barkley, Kentucky Lake, and Land Between the Lakes. This is, I think, this is how it looks now. I think we've got some older maps next to show, you know, this was before the lakes, the rivers. So it's much more narrow confines for the rivers before the lakes were built. And here's a 1956 map. Kentucky Dam had been built, so Kentucky Lake existed on the Tennessee River. And shortly after, probably within 15 years of its completion, Lake Barkley was announced that Barkley Dam would be built on the Cumberland River. As the crow flies, they're just about 2 miles apart. So these were two monumental projects that in a very tight area. So Some people were affected by these changes multiple times because if they had to leave their homes for the Kentucky Lake and Kentucky Dam project, they might have moved a little further east over into Lyon County or Treve County. And they might have been confronted again with having to give up their home when Barkley was built. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy announced that there would be a new recreation area known as Land Between the Lakes. This area had previously been known as Between the Rivers when there were rivers there. And this area, 170,000 acres were taken through the power of eminent domain and to form this recreation area. So many communities were lost, many personal home sites. I want to read a little bit about that. The dam and the reservoirs displaced thousands of residents and submerged several towns, but a significant diaspora from the region didn't occur. Most people relocated to nearby communities. Some moved from the banks of the Tennessee to homes on the Cumberland to remain river people, while others moved to Between the Rivers. Several families were displaced multiple times by the public projects that followed. In less than 20 years, and a mere 2 miles away from Kentucky Dam, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers completed Barkley Dam on the Cumberland River. It was named for Vice President Alvin Barkley, the original Veep, also a Western Kentuckian. Eddyville and Catawba were relocated to nearby higher ground and rebuilt as new towns. The old towns were then demolished in preparation for the higher water levels. A few original houses remain at both sites, as well as the Kentucky State Penitentiary, perched close to a limestone bluff in Old Eddyville. The federal government already owned a 57,000-acre portion of the peninsula known as Between the Rivers. And this tract had been called the Kentucky Woodlands National Wildlife Refuge. But the LBL project required more land. Residents protested and fought to keep their property, but in the end, the government took it all, over 170,000 acres. More than 800 families were forced out. There's no question that electrification in this rural part of the country sparked dramatic economic growth and provided thousands of good-paying jobs at new chemical plants and industrial plants. There's no doubt the region needed reliable river navigation and flood control, especially after the devastation of the catastrophic 1937 flood and other frequent but significant flooding. The lakes drove a wave of development that attracted tourists to recreational opportunities of boating, fishing, and swimming, and paved the way for increased tax revenues that lifted towns, counties, and school districts out of poverty. But there was a price to be paid for progress, and here, some folks paid dearly. Kentucky has few natural lakes, but 43 constructed reservoirs dot the landscape. Communities in every part of the state have their stories of drowned towns and lost places, including Lake Cumberland, Dale Hollow, Rough River, Green River, Nolan, and Taylorsville Lakes, just to name a few. In the region, major reservoirs include Pickwick, Lanier, Old Hickory, Percy Creek, Norris, and Fontana. The history of these projects and our march toward his progress are inextricably linked to the sacrifices of those who can never go home again. So I'm going to read a bit from Drowned Town to give you an idea. I decided to write it in the form of linked short stories so that I could tell many different stories and many different versions of this loss. I have two main characters who are women friends. They met in college. One is from the old town of Eddyville. One is from Louisville. They're very different people, sort of opposite type personalities. Another major character is their friend Neville, who also grew up in Old Eddyville, and by chance is a history professor at North State University in the book. So I have other voices. I have a story about a prisoner at the Kentucky State Penitentiary watching the old town of Eddyville be razed in preparation for the flooding. I have another character who is an appraiser who lives in Mayfield and is coming over to the between the lakes, or between the rivers area to appraise land for the Land Between the Lakes project. And he has a different perspective because he's not coming from a river, a place that's connected to the river as much. Before I read though, I do want to get to some more slides just to show you what life was like in the old towns of Catawba and Eddyville. They were bustling towns. Eddyville has always been the county seat, but Catawba was a major town too. It's a beach and a marina and a small little bay that's protected by a jetty. That train depot is right in the curve there of that area. Or signs of old Catawba, obviously in the 1950s from that car. And this is Eddyville. This is an aerial shot before. You can see how narrow the river is, and Eddyville was built, and Catawba, along a series of bends in the river. In fact, there's an older development called Bend of the Rivers because they're pretty prominent when you look at it on the map. Again, a very bustling town, commercial center for Lyon County. Golden Pond is also another lost place. It's in Trigg County. Now it is just where the Land Between the Lakes Visitor Center and the planetarium is located. There was a whole town there just down 6880 that now runs through there. There's a wonderful overlook that's been put up recently in Golden Pond that gives you an idea of what this town was like before it was deconstructed. The goal in Land Between the Lakes was to make it into pristine woods and a recreation area as though no one had ever lived there or that it had never been developed. So I think it's important to remember that these were important communities in these counties. There you go. And Linton is another town that you don't hear very much about either. There by the bridge that goes over to LBL. Fenton is another, it was another small but bustling tourist center mostly. It was before Land Between the Lakes, so there were opportunities for restaurants and hotels and things like that in Land Between the Lakes after Kentucky Lake had been built, but before the recreation area was purchased. An important thing to consider is the public interest in preventing floods. These towns suffered mightily through multiple floods. There's the train station again during the 37 flood, which was catastrophic. Eddyville also, you can see by those storefronts that it was a significant flood. Also flooded Paducah and Louisville. And so there is a significant public interest which allowed the government to pursue taking the property through eminent domain. There always has to be a public interest in securing property, taking property from homeowners or business owners. So, and if you, every time I see this photograph, I think of, there's a little strand of islands and a tree still located in Lake Barkley. If you cross the bridge there at Canton, there is, I believe it's a bald cypress tree. And I think it's the remnants of the old river banks. And those, just in the last year or two, one of the little islands left has sort of deteriorated to the point that it is going away. So I think it's important to recognize that those little traces of the past are there. but may not be there forever. And there's Canton before the lake. And here's Lake Barkley, or Barkley Dam under construction. And that is, you know, between Catawba and Lake City. And this is a picture from Eddyville as they were tearing things down. The whole town was, not the whole town, but most of the town was deconstructed. And moved to New Eddyville, which a lot of people still call it New Eddyville and New Catawba. You know, that's a historical trace also. I'm not sure how long that will go on. And a lot of homes were moved, either from the old towns or from between the rivers. Model Tennessee was also lost when Land Between the Lakes was created. Mary Major's Restaurant, which was a true landmark in Between the Rivers, it was later moved to between Catawba and New Catawba and New Eddyville. And she operated the restaurant for many years. There were just a lot of communities that we take for granted weren't there. Sardis. And here's a photograph of the protest that went on. Protests not only went on, you know, in person, but also through the court system. And ultimately, the Supreme Court denied to hear the case and found that the Court of Appeals decision that there was a justifiable public interest in taking that land was correct. And so the legal battle ended at that point. This is one of the homes that in Land Between the Lakes, the Marlar home. He was a riverboat captain, and he built this house in the late 1950s. But it is often called Hotel California now, and sort of a spot for people to go and look at this place. It's one of the few structures that still exists in Land Between the Lakes. I'm not sure why it was left intact, maybe an oversight, but it is a graffiti place of artwork at this point. It has been, so even the trees leading to it, you know you're on the right path because all the trees are graffitied and painted too. It's pretty amazing, but this was someone's home. In Between the Rivers, a lot of homes were moved. You can see that this home is they're prepping it to move, taking the brick off and then taking it by barge. And a lot of those were moved to Catawba, New Catawba, New Eddyville. And even the Holiday Restaurant, we saw that earlier in Fenton, and it was moved too. I think it was moved to Aurora. Just part of the process. And that's what Golden Pond looks like today. And it's about at that spot where there's a bronze marker for what used to be there. And one in Eddyville also. There's also one in Catawba. And this is what it looks like at Winter Pool, where you can see bricks from foundations and Fox sidewalks. This is one of the only surviving buildings that's still intact, but it was reclaimed. St. Stephen's Church apparently was not on the tax rolls at the time LBL was bought out, all the property was bought out. It had been decommissioned as a Catholic church in the early 1950s. So people weren't going there. When Barkley Dam was built and the area flooded, it cut off the main road to this church. So no one went there, and it just stood there from 1964 when the water came up and shut the road to about 1990, I think, was when a group of former residents started thinking about the possibility of renovating it and saving it. And I think by 2000, maybe 2001, it had been completely renovated. It is a beautiful spot. When they first found it and started the project and got permission from TVA to do this work, they had to backpack all the materials in. There was not a road in. So apparently a road was cut, and that was a good step. And the project was done completely by volunteer hours from former residents of Between the Rivers. It's a beautiful place. If you ever get a chance to go, I would encourage that. It also survived the tornado from December 10th. The tornado was less than a quarter of a mile away, and massive destruction. Probably the area of most destruction inland between the lakes from the same tornado, of course, that unfortunately came and hit Mayfield and did such destruction here. But the little church survived again. They had already decorated it for Christmas. The Christmas wreaths and the bows had not even blown off the door and the windows, which is like another miraculous event.